The morning Arya's grandmother died, the old woman pressed a leather pouch into her hands and whispered, "Hide these where the fire cannot reach." 3 hours later, soldiers wearing the gray uniforms of the agricultural ministry burned every seed vault in the village, and Arya understood that her grandmother had known they were coming. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The pouch felt heavier than it should have as Arya watched smoke rise from the community granary. She was 17, thin as a reed from the rationing, with dirt permanently embedded under her fingernails from working her family's small plot. The other villagers stood in a silent cluster while ministry officials read from prepared statements about contamination risks and necessary precautions. The words meant nothing. Everyone knew what this really was. Her mother's hand found her shoulder, squeezed once, then released. They couldn't afford to draw attention. Not now. Not with the pouch burning against Arya's ribs, where she'd tucked it inside her threadbare shirt. The seeds were heritage varieties. Her grandmother had explained in fragments over the years, when she thought no one else was listening. Before the simplification, before the ministry had mandated that only certified, sterile crops could be planted, there had been thousands of different plants. Tomatoes that tasted like the earth after rain, corn in colors beyond yellow, beans that could survive drought and flood and still produce enough to feed a family through winter. Now there were 12 approved varieties for the entire region. 12 crops that required expensive fertilizers and pesticides, sold exclusively by ministry-approved distributors. 12 plants that produced seeds incapable of germination, forcing farmers to purchase new stock every season. 12 ways to ensure compliance through hunger. The fire burned for 3 days. Arya's village, Millbrook, sat in what had once been called the breadbasket, a sprawling agricultural zone that had fed millions before the climate, wars, and the subsequent reorganization. Now it fed the cities while the farmers themselves survived on rations of processed nutrition bars and whatever vegetables they could coax from their assigned plots. The soil had grown tired. Yields dropped every year despite the chemical inputs, or perhaps because of them. But questioning the ministry's methods meant questioning the system that kept society from collapsing entirely. And no one had the energy for rebellion when they were too exhausted from simply trying to survive. Arya had never known her grandfather. He'd been disappeared 20 years ago for operating an illegal seed library. Her grandmother never spoke of him directly, but sometimes when her hands moved through the soil, her lips would form words that might have been prayers or might have been promises. On the 4th morning after the burning, Arya woke before dawn and slipped from the house. Her younger brother, Finn, slept in his corner, his breathing raspy from the respiratory illness that plagued half the children in the village. The approved crops were nutritionally adequate, the ministry claimed, but something essential was missing. People survived, but they didn't thrive. The forest began where the agricultural zones ended, a tangle of wild growth that the ministry hadn't yet found profitable to clear. Arya followed deer paths deeper into the shadows, the pouch clutched against her chest. She needed to find a place the soldiers wouldn't think to search, somewhere she could return to without drawing notice. She'd been walking for perhaps an hour when she heard water. A stream, narrow but strong, cutting through rock and root. Beside it, an ancient oak had fallen decades ago, its massive trunk now hollowed by rot and weather. Arya knelt and peered inside the cavity. Dry, sheltered, hidden by a curtain of ferns. Perfect. Her hands shook as she opened the pouch. Inside were perhaps 50 small envelopes, each labeled in her grandmother's careful script: Brandywine tomato, Blue Hubbard squash, Cherokee Trail of Tears bean, Scarlet Runner, Moon and Stars watermelon. The names alone were poems, speaking of a time when food had identity, when crops carried stories. She couldn't keep them all here. Too risky. If this cache was discovered, centuries of preservation would end. Arya removed 10 envelopes, resealed the pouch, and wedged it deep into the oak's hollow. She covered the entrance with stones and moss until it looked like nothing more than another feature of the forest floor. The 10 envelopes she kept went into a small tin that had once held her grandmother's sewing needles. That tin went back inside her shirt. She would need to create multiple hiding places, distribute the risk. But first, she needed to understand what she was protecting. Back home, she found her mother in the kitchen, staring at the small pile of nutrition bars that constituted their weekly ration. 4 bars each, 28 bars for a family of 7. They were supposed to last. Where did you go? Her mother's voice was flat, exhausted, walking. Couldn't sleep. Her mother's eyes went to Arya's shirt, to the small bulge of the tin. For a moment, something passed between them: recognition, fear, and a weary kind of acceptance. Your grandmother, her mother said slowly, always believed things would change, that someone would remember how to grow real food again. She turned back to the nutrition bars. I told her hope was dangerous. Was she wrong? Her mother didn't answer. Arya spent the next week in careful observation. She watched the ministry patrols, noting their routes and timing. She studied the other villagers, trying to determine who might be sympathetic and who might report unauthorized activity for extra rations. She examined her family's plot, considering where she might plant without drawing attention. The approved crops grew in straight, uniform rows. The tomatoes were identical orbs of red, perfectly round, tasteless. The corn stood at regulated heights, each stalk a clone of the next. The beans produced pods on schedule, engineered for simultaneous harvest. Everything was efficient, predictable, controlled, and dying. Arya saw it in the yellowing leaves, despite the fertilizer applications. In the way, pests developed resistance to the pesticides with each passing season. In the soil itself, which had lost its rich, earthy smell and now had the chemical sharpness of something artificial. The system was eating itself, and everyone pretended not to notice. On the 8th night, Arya's father didn't come home from his shift at the processing plant. Her mother sat at the table, hands folded, waiting. Finn coughed in the corner, the sound wet and painful. Her 3 younger sisters' triplets, age 9, clustered together, their faces pinched with hunger. The nutrition bars were gone. They'd eaten the last one that morning. When her father finally arrived after midnight, he carried a small sack of potatoes. Not the approved variety, which were white and mealy and had all the flavor of cardboard. These were golden, their skins dirty, their shapes irregular. He set them on the table without explanation. Arya's mother stared at them. Where? Don't ask. They ate the potatoes that night, oiled in water from the stream, with nothing but a pinch of salt that her mother had been hoarding. They were the most delicious things Arya had ever tasted, sweet and earthy and real. She saw her siblings' faces transform with each bite, saw her parents exchange glances across the table that spoke of remembered abundance. There are others, her father said quietly as they scraped the pot clean. People who remember. People who've been hiding things. Arya's hand went to her shirt, to the tin that never left her body. Her father's eyes followed the movement. He nodded slowly. We're not alone. The network was small and careful. Arya met them 3 nights later in the basement of the old mill, the building's machinery long since stripped for parts. There were 12 people, their ages ranging from 16 to 70, their faces familiar from the village, but their purpose newly revealed. An elderly man named Tobias led the gathering. He'd been a botanist before the simplification, back when such specializations were still permitted. The ministry wants us to believe that we need them, he said, his voice rough with age and emotion. That without their seeds and their chemicals, we'd starve. But our ancestors fed themselves for 10,000 years before the corporations decided to patent life itself. He explained what Arya had begun to understand on her own. The approved crops were designed for industrial agriculture, for vast monocultures that required mechanical harvesting and long-distance transport. They prioritized shelf life over nutrition, uniformity over resilience. They were never meant to sustain communities. They were meant to control them. Hunger, Tobias continued, is the most effective form of governance. A well-fed population asks questions. A starving one obeys. The others shared what they'd been hiding. A woman named Chun had preserved a dozen varieties of wheat in a false bottom of her root cellar. A young couple, Marcus and Yuki, had been cultivating a small patch of heirloom lettuce behind an abandoned barn, disguising the plants among weeds. An older woman, Sophia, had saved seeds from her mother's garden, which had come from her grandmother's garden, which had been brought across an ocean decades ago. When it was Arya's turn, she described what her grandmother had left her. The other seed savers leaned forward, eyes bright with something that might have been tears or might have been wonder. Heritage varieties, Tobias breathed. We thought they were lost. The ministry's purges 10 years ago. My grandfather hid them, Arya said, before he was taken. My grandmother kept them secret all this time. The room fell silent. The weight of inheritance pressed down on all of them. Marcus spoke first. We need to plant them, not just hide them. Seeds have to grow to stay viable. They need to be refreshed, generation after generation. The patrols, someone began, are predictable, Tobias interrupted, and they're looking for large-scale violations. A few plants here and there, hidden among the approved crops, disguised as weeds, ... double quotes. He smiled, and it was the expression of someone who had been waiting years for this moment. We can do this. We have to do this. They began planning. Each seed saver would take a small number of varieties, selected for their ability to blend with existing plants, or to grow in marginal spaces the ministry didn't monitor. They would document everything: planting dates, growth habits, harvest yields. They would save seeds from the strongest plants, slowly rebuilding populations that had been almost extinguished. It was rebellion measured in millimeters. In a single tomato plant, hidden behind the ministry-approved variety. In bean seeds pressed into soil at the forest's edge. In the quiet defiance of people who refused to forget what food could be. Arya took responsibility for 5 varieties. The Brandywine tomatoes, a purple variety of snap pea, a type of lettuce that could withstand frost, and 2 different beans. Tobias gave her careful instructions for each, explaining their needs and quirks. These weren't the uniform, engineered crops that could tolerate neglect. These were living things that required attention, observation, care. They'll teach you, he said as she prepared to leave. How to watch, how to listen. Plants speak if you know how to hear them. Your grandmother understood that. Arya walked home through the pre-dawn darkness, her tin of seeds somehow heavier than before. She thought about her grandmother's hands in the soil, about the words that might have been prayers or promises. She understood now. They had been both. The first seed she planted was a Brandywine tomato. She chose a spot at the edge of their family plot, where a support pole for the approved variety cast afternoon shade. The ministry tomatoes didn't mind. They'd been engineered for uniformity, not optimization. But a Brandywine, Tobias had explained, was an indeterminate variety that could grow 8 feet tall, producing massive fruits that weighed a pound each. It would need that support pole. Arya dug a hole twice as deep as required for the approved seeds. She added a handful of compost she'd been secretly building behind the shed, mixing kitchen scraps with leaves from the forest. The ministry sold fertilizer, but plants had fed themselves for millions of years before chemicals. They knew how to extract what they needed from organic matter. The seed went into the soil. It was larger than she expected, in a beautiful cream color. She covered it gently, pressing the earth down with her palm. Then she watered it with a cup of water from the stream, not the treated water from the village pump. For 3 days, nothing happened. Arya checked the spot each morning and evening, searching for any sign of germination. The ministry tomatoes, planted the same day, had already sprouted, engineered for rapid growth to maximize production cycles. But the brandywine remained hidden. On the 4th day, she saw it. A curved stem, pushing through the soil, a seed coat still attached. By evening, the cotyledons had opened. 2 small oval leaves that looked nothing like the true leaves that would come later. Arya felt something crack open in her chest, a sensation like spring after a long winter. The plant was alive. Something her grandmother had protected, that her grandfather had died for, was alive and growing. She planted the other seeds over the next week, each in a carefully chosen location. The purple snap peas went along the fence line, where they could climb and blend with the shadows. The frost-tolerant lettuce was scattered among the approved variety, its darker leaves distinct, but not obviously different. The beans went at the forest edge, where they could use saplings for support. Every morning, Arya woke before dawn to check on her hidden plants. She learned their rhythms, their needs. The brandywine grew more slowly than the ministry tomatoes, but its leaves were darker, more robust. The snap peas climbed with determination, their tendrils reaching for any available support. The lettuce sprouted in a loose rosette rather than the tight, uniform heads of the approved variety. They were different. They were beautiful. They were real. Her siblings noticed her early morning excursions. Finn, despite his persistent cough, began following her. He was 12, old enough to keep secrets, but young enough to still believe change was possible. "What are you doing?" he asked one morning as she watered the brandywine with stream water. Arya considered lying. Then she remembered her grandmother's face, the urgency in her dying words. Secrets had kept the seeds alive, but they couldn't restore them. That would require trust, teaching, the slow building of knowledge across generations. "Come here," she said. She showed him the brandywine, explaining how it was different from the ministry tomatoes. She let him touch the leaves, feel their texture. She described what the fruit would taste like, sweet and acidic and complex, nothing like the flavorless orbs from the approved plants. Finn's eyes went wide. "You could be disappeared." "I know." "Why?" Arya struggled to find words for something she felt more than understood. Because someone has to remember. Because food is supposed to nourish us, not just keep us alive. Because she stopped, started again. Because grandmother asked me to. Finn was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Can I help?" She gave him responsibility for the lettuce. Showed him how to thin the seedlings, giving each plant space to develop fully rather than crowding them for maximum yield. He learned to check for pests, to notice when leaves began to yellow from lack of nutrients. He became, without realizing it, a farmer in the old sense, someone who worked with plants rather than simply managing them. The triplets were harder to include. At 9, they were still young enough to accidentally reveal secrets. But they noticed the changes in their older siblings, the new purpose that had given Arya and Finn a strange kind of energy despite their hunger. They asked questions. Arya and Finn showed them the lettuce first. Let them taste a leaf, comparing it to the approved variety. The difference was immediate and undeniable. The heirloom lettuce had flavor bitter and peppery and alive. A ministry version tasted like water with texture. "This is what food used to be," Arya explained, before the corporations decided that efficiency mattered more than taste. Before the government made it illegal to save seeds. The youngest triplet, Mara, frowned. But the teacher says the old ways were dangerous. That people starved because crops failed. Some crops failed, Arya acknowledged. But when you have hundreds of varieties, some always survive. Diversity is resilience. The ministry system gives us uniformity, which means if something goes wrong, Everything fails at once. She was repeating Tobias's words, but as she spoke them, she understood their truth. The approved crops were genetic clones. A single disease, a single pest, could wipe them out entirely. The heirloom varieties, shaped by generations of selection across different environments, carried defenses that genetic engineers would never think to include. The triplets became watchers. They monitored the patrol schedules, providing early warning when ministry officials entered the village. They created distractions when needed, asking questions or pretending to need help. They were too young to tend plants, but they could protect those who did. Her parents said nothing, but Arya caught them watching with expressions she couldn't quite read. Fear, certainly, but also something that might have been pride. 6 weeks after planting, the Brandywine tomato set its first fruit. Arya almost missed it. A small, yellow flower had appeared 3 days earlier, and she'd been watching it with fascination. The approved tomatoes self-pollinated, engineered for reliability. But the Brandywine needed insects, needed the collaboration of the wider ecosystem. She'd seen wild bees in the area, probably refugees from the industrial agricultural zones where pesticide use had devastated their populations. They'd found the Brandywine, drawn by something in its flowers that the ministry varieties lacked. And now, where the flower had been, a small green bulb was swelling. Arya touched it gently. The tomato was already the size of her thumbnail, ridged and irregular. Nothing like the perfect spheres of the approved variety. It looked like something alive rather than something manufactured. The other seed savers reported similar progress. Chun's wheat was growing in hidden patches throughout the village, disguised among the approved grain. Marcus and Yuki's lettuce patch had expanded, providing fresh greens to a select few. Sophia's beans were climbing toward the sky, their purple flowers a secret signal to those who knew how to look. They began sharing small harvests. Nothing that would be noticed by the ministry, but enough to remind people what food could taste like. A handful of peas, split among 3 families. A single perfect lettuce head, its leaves divided and distributed. Each taste was a memory unlocked, a reminder of abundance that had been deliberately erased. The network grew. People Arya had thought of as compliant, as broken by the system, revealed themselves as careful rebels. They'd been waiting for a sign, for someone to take the first risk. Now they wanted seeds of their own. Tobias called a meeting to discuss expansion. "We're successful," he said, his voice carrying warning rather than celebration. "Which means we're becoming visible. The ministry doesn't tolerate success outside their system." He was right to be worried. 3 days later, a patrol arrived unscheduled. They weren't the regular agricultural inspectors, but members of the compliance division, dressed in black rather than gray. They moved through the village with scanners, devices that measured soil composition and nutrient levels. Arya watched from a distance, her heart pounding. The scanners could detect unauthorized amendments, the compost she'd been adding, the different microbial profiles of healthy soil. If they checked her family's plot thoroughly, they'd find the Brandywine. But the patrol moved quickly, more interested in the community spaces than individual plots. They scanned the burned seed vault, the common areas, the irrigation systems. They took soil samples from the main fields. Then they left, providing no explanation. The village held its collective breath. Something had drawn their attention. But what? And would they return? Chun approached Arya 2 nights later. The older woman's face was drawn, aged by worry. "We need to stop," she said. "My husband is afraid. He says the risk is too great." What did the patrol want? I don't know. But the scanners, their new technology, more sensitive. If they return with those devices and actually search individual plots, ... double quotes, she didn't finish the sentence. Arya understood the fear. Discovery meant disappearance, not just for the person found with illegal seeds, but often for their entire family. The ministry used collective punishment to discourage rebellion. Help your neighbor plant an heirloom tomato, and your children might pay the price. But stopping meant accepting permanent dependence. It meant watching her brother's health decline, watching her sisters grow up, never knowing what real food tasted like. It meant letting her grandmother's life's work turn to dust in a hidden oak tree. "We'll be more careful," Arya said. "Smaller plantings, better camouflage." You don't understand," Sean interrupted. "My husband will report me if I continue. He's been talking to the compliance officer. He thinks cooperation might earn him a position at the processing plant." The betrayal was physical, a punch to Arya's stomach. "He'd turn you in." His own wife? Hunger does things to people. Sean's voice was hollow. "Makes them desperate. Makes them cruel." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small container. "This is everything I have left. Take it. Hide it. Maybe someday ... She stopped, unable to finish. Arya took the container. Inside were perhaps 24 seed packets, carefully labeled in Shun's precise handwriting. A lifetime of preservation handed over in an act of surrender. "I'm sorry," Chun whispered. Then she was gone, disappearing into the darkness. The news spread through the network. Chun's husband had indeed made contact with the compliance division. He'd offered information in exchange for guaranteed rations and possible employment. He didn't know details. Chun had been careful, but he knew something was happening. That was enough to bring the patrols back. "We have to shut down," someone said at the emergency meeting. "Destroy the plants, bury the seeds. Wait until this blows over." "It won't blow over," Tobias said quietly. "The ministry is tightening control because the system is failing. Crop yields are down 30% across the region. They're blaming sabotage, but the truth is their sterile monocultures are collapsing. They need scapegoats. Then we're dead," Marcus said flatly. "If they search thoroughly, they'll find everything." Arya thought about the brandywine tomato, now bearing fruit the size of her fist. About Finn's careful tending of the lettuce. About her grandmother's whispered instructions. About the wild bees that had found their way to living flowers. "What if we don't hide?" she said. Everyone turned to stare at her. "What if we plant more? What if we plant so much that they can't possibly eliminate it all? What if we give seeds to everyone, not just our network, and let the plants grow wild?" "That's insane," someone said. "That's suicide." "Maybe." Arya pulled out her tin, opened it to reveal the envelopes inside. "But these seeds have survived decades of suppression. My grandfather died protecting them. My grandmother kept them alive through the worst of the purges. They're survivors. And if we scatter them widely enough, some will survive whatever the ministry does next." Tobias was nodding slowly. "Guerrilla gardening. But on a massive scale. Not just our network, the entire village. The forests, the abandoned areas. Anywhere a seed might take root. They'll come for us," Yuki said. "They're already coming. At least this way, we leave something behind." The decision was made without voting, without formal agreement. People simply began moving. Sophia distributed her bean seeds, pressing packets into the hands of neighbors she'd never spoken to about resistance. Marcus and Yuki took lettuce to the school, showing children how to scatter seeds in the neglected areas behind the building. Tobias walked to the forest's edge and broadcast wheat seeds among the trees, creating wild populations that might or might not survive, but would at least have a chance. Arya took the brandywine tomatoes. 3 fruits had ripened to a deep red purple and held a quiet ceremony in her family's kitchen. She cut the first tomato, revealing the dense, seed-filled interior. The smell alone was enough to make her siblings gasp. Sweet and acidic and earthy, it was the scent of summer, of abundance, of everything the ministry had tried to erase. They ate it slowly, reverently. The flavor exploded across Arya's tongue, complex and rich and intensely real. She saw tears on her mother's face, saw her father close his eyes as if in prayer. Finn laughed out loud, the sound startling in their usually quiet home. The triplets demanded more, their small hands reaching. "This is why," Arya said, saving the seeds on a piece of cloth. "This is what we're fighting for." Her mother spoke for the first time about the resistance. "Your grandmother used to make a salad from her garden. 20 different types of lettuce and greens, each with its own flavor. She'd add edible flowers, herbs we don't even have names for anymore. It would take her an hour to harvest everything, to compose the bowl. And it was, her voice broke. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Color and texture and taste that made you understand what food could be. What it should be. We can have that again," Arya said. "Not today, maybe not for years. But if we plant enough seeds, if we teach enough people, eventually ... Her father shook his head. "The ministry won't allow it. They'll burn everything again. Then we plant again, and again, until they can't keep up, until enough people remember that there's another way." They saved the seeds from all 3 tomatoes, spreading them on the cloth to dry. Over 100 seeds from a single fruit geometric growth, if they could establish just a few plants. Arya divided them into small packets, each containing 5 or 6 seeds. Enough to start, not enough to devastate if lost. The next morning, she walked through the village distributing packets to anyone who would take them. Some people refused, fear overriding curiosity, but others accepted with expressions of wonder or determination. An elderly man who had been a farmer before the simplification held his packet with shaking hands. A young mother tucked hers into her pocket, glancing at her malnourished children. A teenager pocketed his with a grin that suggested he'd been waiting his whole life for permission to rebel. By evening, Arya had distributed over 500 seeds. Not just from the Brandywine, but from Chun's collection, from her grandmother's pouch, from the other seed saver stores. They were creating a diaspora, sending seeds into the world with no guarantee of their survival, but with the certainty that some would find a way. The patrols returned a week later. This time they brought specialist botanists who had been trained to identify unauthorized plants. They moved through the village with purpose, examining individual plots with equipment that could detect genetic markers. Arya watched them find her Brandywine plant, watched the specialists scan it, compare the readings to a database, then mark the location on a digital map. The man's face showed no emotion as he uprooted the plant, now bearing 6 large fruits, and tossed it onto a growing pile of contraband vegetation. They found Chun's wheat, Marcus and Yuki's lettuce, Sophia's beans. Every plant the network had carefully cultivated was identified and destroyed. The pile of pulled plants grew until it was taller than Arya. It represented months of work, the patient tending of dozens of people. The patrol burned the pile that evening. The entire village was required to attend, to bear witness to the consequences of deviation. A compliance division officer read a prepared statement about the dangers of genetic contamination and the necessity of maintaining approved crop standards. His voice was flat, bureaucratic, devoid of any recognition that he was describing the destruction of living things. Arya stood with her family and watched the flames consume the Brandywine plant. She thought about the 3 fruits they'd harvested, about the seeds now hidden in homes throughout the village. The plant was dead, but its children were already scattered. The officer finished his statement and issued a warning. Any further violations will result in criminal charges. We are implementing enhanced monitoring protocols. Report any suspicious activity to your local compliance office. Then, as an afterthought, rations for this district will be reduced by 20% due to the resources required for this enforcement action. The punishment was collective. The village would go hungrier because some among them had tried to grow real food. The cruelty was intentional, designed to turn neighbors against each other, to make rebellion into a betrayal of community. It might have worked, except for what happened 3 days later. The ministry's approved tomato crop failed, not just in Millbrook, but across the entire region. A fungal pathogen, one that had evolved resistance to every approved fungicide, swept through the industrial monocultures with devastating speed. Within a week, every approved tomato plant was dead or dying. The red fruits turned black and collapsed, releasing spores that ensured the disease's spread. The ministry issued emergency statements. They blamed climate change, sabotage, the natural evolution of pests. They promised new resistant varieties within a season. But everyone knew the truth. The system had been too uniform, too fragile. A single disease had destroyed everything because everything was genetically identical. Arya walked through the ruins of her family's plot, looking at the blackened stalks of the ministry tomatoes. The brandywine had been pulled 2 weeks earlier, but it had lived long enough to set seed. And it had been different enough, genetically diverse enough, that the fungus might not have touched it. She thought about diversity as resilience, about the hundreds of heirloom varieties that had been destroyed over the years, each one carrying unique resistances that might have prevented this catastrophe. The ministry had sacrificed resilience for control, and now everyone was paying the price. The rations shrank again. People began to show signs of serious malnutrition. Finn's cough worsened until he could barely walk without becoming winded. The triplets grew quiet, conserving energy. Throughout the village, children stopped playing. The old and sick began to die. Arya retrieved one of the brandywine seed packets she'd hidden and planted 12 seeds in a marginal area behind the abandoned barn where Marcus and Yuki had grown their lettuce. If the patrols came again, they'd destroy these plants too. But the alternative was to do nothing while people starved. The seeds germinated. She tended them in secret, visiting before dawn and after dusk. The plants grew slowly without the chemical inputs the ministry tomatoes received, but they grew healthy, strong, resistant. Other people were doing the same. Arya saw plants appearing in unexpected places, along fence lines, in the forest, in the neglected corners of community spaces. People had kept seeds from the distribution, had waited for the patrols to move on, and were now planting in defiance or desperation, or both. The compliance division returned. They found some of the new plantings and destroyed them, but they couldn't find all of them. The guerrilla garden was too dispersed, too organic. For every plant they pulled, 2 more appeared elsewhere. A strange new rhythm developed. The ministry would patrol, destroy, and threaten. The villagers would wait, and plant again. It was inefficient and exhausting, and resulted in minimal actual harvest. But it was also impossible to fully suppress. Arya's 12 brandywine plants produced fruit. She harvested them at night, careful not to be seen. A yield was smaller than it would have been with proper care, but it was real food grown from saved seeds. She divided the fruit among families with young children, prioritizing those whose kids showed the worst signs of malnutrition. Each tomato was sliced thin, distributed so widely that a single fruit might feed 10 families. The portions were tiny, but they were enough to remind people of what they were fighting for. And each fruit contained seeds, hundreds of them, potentially thousands as they were shared and replanted. Tobias called another meeting. The old botanist looked exhausted, his frame thinner than ever. But his eyes were bright. "We're winning," he said, and the statement was so unexpected that everyone went silent. "How can you say that?" Sophia demanded. "We're starving. The patrols are destroying everything we plant." "The ministry is losing control," Tobias interrupted. "Their approved crops failed. Their sterile seeds can't adapt. They're facing food shortages in the cities, not just in the agricultural zones. For the first time since the simplification, the system is openly failing." He pulled out a battered tablet, its screen cracked but functional. "I've been monitoring underground networks. Other regions are experiencing similar problems. The monocultures are collapsing everywhere. Pests are evolving faster than the engineers can modify crops. The soil is depleted. and people are starting to ask questions. The tablet showed reports from across the continent. Cities where rations had been cut to starvation levels. Industrial farms abandoned because the soil could no longer support even chemically enhanced growth. Protests, usually quickly suppressed, calling for a return to traditional agriculture. The ministry will adapt, Marcus said. They'll engineer new crops, implement stricter controls. With what? Tobias smiled. Genetic engineering requires genetic diversity. They need heritage varieties to provide the traits they're trying to replicate. And we're systematically destroying the seed banks they've been raiding. The vault they burned here contained the last known samples of 24 varieties. Samples they needed for their research. Arya understood. They're eating their seed corn. Exactly. Every heritage variety they destroy makes their job harder. Every heirloom that goes extinct limits their options. They can't control what they can't create, and they can't create without accessing the very diversity they've been suppressing. The revelation shifted something in the room. The rebellion had felt desperate, doomed to fail. But maybe it wasn't about winning in the traditional sense. Maybe it was about survival, about keeping alternative options alive until the dominant system collapsed from its own contradictions. So what do we do? Yuki asked. What we've been doing, Tobias said. We save seeds. We plant. We share. We teach. And we wait for the system to realize it needs us more than we need it. The waiting was hard. Winter came, and with it, deeper hunger. The ministry's promised replacement crops didn't materialize. The enhanced rations never arrived. The processing plant where Arya's father worked reduced its hours and closed entirely. There simply wasn't enough food to process. People began to leave the village, seeking better conditions in the cities. But the cities were no better off. The industrial food system was global, and it was failing everywhere at once. The refugees returned with stories of riots, of markets empty of anything but processed nutrition bars, of governments implementing martial law to maintain order. Arya's family huddled together through the cold months, burning furniture when the fuel rations ran out. They ate one meal a day, usually a Finn soup made from whatever they could forage. Finn's cough became pneumonia. The doctors had no medicine to offer. The pharmaceutical supply chains were collapsing along with everything else. On a night when the temperature dropped below freezing and Finn's breathing became labored, Arya made a decision. She retrieved her grandmother's pouch from the hollow oak tree. The leather was cold and stiff, but the seeds inside were protected. She brought them home and showed her mother. Grandmother was saving these for the future, Arya said. But if Finn doesn't survive the winter, there is no future. Her mother stared at the envelopes, tears freezing on her cheeks. What would you have us do? Trade them. Some of these varieties might be unique, worth something to the ministry, to their research programs. Enough to buy medicine. Real food, whatever Finn needs. Your grandmother died protecting these, and Finn is dying without them. She'd understand. They argued through the night, their voices low to avoid waking the children. Arya's father sided with her save the child, who was dying now, rather than preserving seeds for a hypothetical future. Her mother resisted, seeing it as a betrayal of everything Arya's grandmother had fought for. In the end, Finn himself made the decision. He woke near dawn, his breathing rattling and wet. Don't, he managed between coughs. Please, don't trade the seeds. Not for me. You're dying, Arya said bluntly. Then I die. But those seeds, he coughed, the sound tearing through his thin chest. Those seeds could save everyone. Not just me. You said it yourself. Diversity is resilience. You can't trade resilience for one person. You're not just one person. You're my brother. And those are humanity's inheritance. Finn smiled weakly. Grandmother taught me too, you know. When you were off being serious and responsible, she'd tell me stories. About a time when gardens had hundreds of plants. When people knew the names of vegetables we've never even heard of. When food was more than fuel, it was culture, community, joy. He paused to breathe. That world is worth more than me. Arya wanted to argue, but found she couldn't, because he was right, and they both knew it. Trading the seeds might save Finn, but it would doom everyone else to continued dependence on a system that was murdering them slowly. The seeds represented possibility, the chance to rebuild something better from the ruins of the present. She put the pouch away. Finn nodded, then closed his eyes. He died 3 days later. They buried him in a section of the forest where wild plants grew, marking the grave with a smooth river stone. Arya placed a single seed one of the Cherokee Trail of Tears beans in the soil above his body. Perhaps it would grow. Perhaps it would be eaten by an animal or rot in the cold. But it seemed right to plant something living in a place of death. The funeral was attended by most of the village, despite the freezing weather. People who had never spoken to Arya's family came to pay respects. They brought small offerings, a handful of dried beans, a precious apple saved from the fall harvest, a sprig of pine that remained green through the winter. After the service, Tobias approached Arya. The old man looked ancient now, bent under the weight of the winter and the losses it had brought. "Your brother understood something important," he said. "This isn't about any one person. It's about all of us. Past, present, and future." He was 12, old enough to understand what matters. Tobias handed her a small envelope. "This is the last of my wheat. I've kept it for years, but I'm not going to make it to spring. Take it. Add it to your collection. Teach someone else. Keep the chain unbroken. You're not dying. Everyone's dying, child. The question is what we leave behind." He closed her fingers around the envelope. "Promise me you'll survive, that you'll plant these when the time is right, that you'll remember not just the seeds, but why they matter," Arya promised. Tobias died a week later, succumbing to the same respiratory infection that had taken Finn. His death was noted in the ministry records as malnutrition-related illness, which was technically true, but completely inadequate. He died because a system that prioritized control over care had decided his life wasn't worth the resources required to sustain it. The seed savers gathered for another funeral. They were fewer now. People had died, or given up, or simply lost the energy to continue fighting. But those who remained were tempered by loss, hardened into something that couldn't be easily broken. Sophia spoke at the service. "Tobias used to say that seeds are patient, that they can wait decades or even centuries for the right conditions. That our job isn't to force growth, but to preserve possibility until the moment is right." She looked at the gathered mourners, her eyes fierce despite their weariness. "The moment is coming. I can feel it. The system is breaking. And when it finally collapses, we'll be ready to plant something better in its place." They scattered Tobias's ashes in the field where he'd broadcast his wheat seeds months earlier. Arya looked out at the snowy expanse and imagined spring green shoots emerging, wild populations of forgotten grains reclaiming abandoned space. It seemed impossible in the dead of winter, but seeds specialized in the impossible. The ministry's control began to fracture in early spring. Patrols became sporadic, then stopped entirely. The processing plant never reopened. The compliance office was abandoned. For several weeks, no one came from the cities. No supplies, no officials, no communication. Then the refugees began arriving. Not people fleeing to the cities, but people fleeing from them. They came in small groups, exhausted and starving, with stories of complete social breakdown. The industrial food system had collapsed so thoroughly that cities of millions were left with no supply chains at all. Governments had fallen or retreated into fortified zones, protecting the elite while abandoning everyone else. The refugees were seeking farmland, hoping that rural areas might still produce food. What they found were villages as hungry as they were, fields lying fallow because there were no ministry-approved seeds to plant, communities barely surviving on foraged foods, and whatever they'd hidden from the patrols. Arya watched the desperate masses arriving and felt the weight of her grandmother's pouch pressing against her ribs where she now kept it. She had seeds that could grow food, not enough to feed everyone, but enough to start. The question was whether to reveal them. The decision was made for her when a group of refugees began stripping bark from trees to eat, a sign of desperate starvation. Among them was a small girl, maybe 5 years old, who reminded Arya painfully of her youngest sister. The child was crying, not from hunger, but from watching her mother try to chew wood pulp. Arya walked to the hollow oak and retrieved the full collection. Every seed her grandfather had hidden, her grandmother had protected, Tobias had contributed, Chun had surrendered. It represented decades of preservation, centuries of agricultural knowledge, the genetic heritage of countless traditional farmers who had bred these plants across generations. She brought the collection to the village square where the refugees had gathered. People stared as she opened the pouch and began spreading envelopes on a makeshift table. "These are seeds," she announced, "heritage varieties. They're not sterile like the ministry crops. They'll produce plants that make more seeds. If we're careful, if we share the harvest and save seed from the best plants, we can feed ourselves. Maybe not this year, maybe not enough for everyone, but it's a start." The silence was profound. People stared at the envelopes as if they were looking at artifacts from a lost civilization, which in a sense they were. These seeds represented a world before the simplification, before corporations had decided to patent life itself. "Those are illegal," someone said. "There is no law anymore," Arya replied. "The ministry is gone. The system that made these illegal no longer exists. All that's left is us, and the choice of whether to survive or starve while obeying rules that no longer matter." She picked up an envelope. Cherokee Trail of Tears beans, the label read in her grandmother's handwriting. These beans were carried along a forced migration route. People who were being removed from their ancestral lands chose to carry these seeds. They valued them enough to preserve them through that horror. And they've been passed down ever since, generation to generation, waiting for the moment they'd be needed. She held up another envelope. Moon and Stars watermelon. This variety almost went extinct in the 1980s. A single farmer kept it alive, sharing seeds with anyone who asked. It survived because people believed that diversity mattered, that we couldn't afford to lose even one variety. Envelope after envelope, each with a story, each representing human choices made across decades or centuries to preserve something valuable. Together, they represented not just food but culture, history, the accumulated wisdom of countless farmers who had understood that seeds were inheritance. "I can't promise these will save us," Arya said. "I can't promise there's enough. But I can promise that if we plant them, save seed from the harvest, and share what we grow, we have a chance." The ministry tried to make us dependent, to ensure we could never feed ourselves. "These seeds are the proof that they failed." She began distributing seeds, not randomly, but carefully, choosing varieties that matched people's knowledge and resources. Experienced gardeners received the more finicky varieties. Those with access to good soil got the heavy feeders. People with limited space received compact varieties. Each packet came with instructions, with warnings, with encouragement. The refugees who had been trying to eat bark received the hardiest varieties plants that could tolerate poor soil, insufficient water, inexperienced care. Purple snap peas that fixed their own nitrogen. Scarlet runner beans that could climb anything. Lettuce that could be harvested leaf by leaf, providing continuous food. "This isn't charity," Arya told them. "We're creating a network. Every person who receives seeds has a responsibility to save seeds from their harvest and share them with others. We're not just feeding ourselves this year. We're rebuilding the foundation that will feed generations." The planting began the next day. People who had never farmed before learned from the village elders. They prepared soil by hand, having no access to machinery or chemical inputs. They planted too thick, then learned to thin. They overwatered, then learned to recognize moisture stress. They made every possible mistake, but they learned. Arya moved through the emerging gardens, teaching and troubleshooting. She showed people how to identify pest damage, how to build trellises from scavenged materials, how to recognize nutrient deficiencies. She shared the knowledge Tobias had given her, which he had received from farmers who had learned from their parents, creating a chain of wisdom stretching back millennia. The first food came quickly. Lettuce could be harvested in 30 days. The snap peas began producing in 6 weeks. These weren't huge harvests, but they were real food, fresh and alive. People who had survived on nutrition bars and foraged bark wept at the taste of a fresh pea pod. The tomatoes took longer. Arya planted her remaining brandywine seeds in a sheltered area with the best soil, determined to produce a perfect harvest that would yield maximum seed. She tended them obsessively, checking for pests, adjusting water, pinching suckers to direct energy toward fruit production. 70 days after planting, the first brandywine fruit ripened. It was enormous, nearly 2 pounds, its skin a deep red purple that seemed to glow in the afternoon sun. Arya harvested it reverently, cradling it like something precious. She held a ceremony that evening. The entire community gathered as she sliced the tomato, revealing its dense, seed-filled interior. The smell alone was transcendent sweet and acidic and deeply earthy. She divided the fruit into small portions, ensuring everyone received at least a taste. The reaction was immediate. People who had forgotten what flavor meant were suddenly reminded. Parents fed tiny pieces to their children and watched their faces transform. Elderly villagers closed their eyes, transported to memories of gardens from their youth. The refugees, many of whom had never tasted an heirloom tomato, simply stood in stunned silence. "This is what we're fighting for," Arya said, holding up a seed she'd extracted from the fruit. "Not just survival, not just enough calories to keep breathing, but this food that nourishes the body and the spirit, food that carries stories, food that tastes like summer and hope and the future we're going to build." She placed the seed in an envelope. "I'm going to save every seed from this harvest, and next year we'll have more plants, and the year after more still. We'll share them with other communities, other regions. We'll rebuild the diversity that was stolen from us. And eventually, we'll have gardens again, not industrial plots of identical clones, but gardens with hundreds of varieties, each one adapted to local conditions, each one bringing something unique to the table." The harvests continued through summer. The beans produced prolifically, climbing fences and trees, their purple flowers drawing wild pollinators. The squash sprawled across disturbed ground, their huge leaves shading out weeds. The wheat grew in wild patches, mixing with native grasses, creating hybrid populations that would be shaped by natural selection. People learned to save seeds. Arya taught them to choose fruits from the best plants, to let pods fully mature on the vine, to store seeds in cool, dry conditions. She explained genetic diversity, why they should save seed from multiple plants rather than just one, how to maintain variety integrity while also allowing for adaptation. The network expanded beyond Millbrook. Refugees carried seeds to other communities. Reports came back of gardens appearing in abandoned city lots, of rooftop farms, of guerrilla plantings in parks and along highways. The Ministry Seed Vault destruction had been meant to eliminate alternatives. Instead, it had forced people to scatter seeds so widely that suppression was now impossible. Not everything succeeded. Some varieties proved poorly adapted to the changed climate. Some gardens failed due to inexperience or bad luck. Pests destroyed entire plantings. Drought withered carefully tended crops. The failures were devastating, but they were also educational. People learned which varieties worked in their conditions, which planting times were best, which companion planting combinations helped or hindered. Arya documented everything. She filled notebooks with observations, which varieties showed disease resistance, which produced well in poor soil, which attracted beneficial insects. She was creating a new agricultural knowledge base, one built on actual growing conditions rather than industrial assumptions. By fall, the community had food, not abundance, not yet, but enough to survive the winter without relying on external systems that no longer existed. The harvest celebration was simple shared meals of foods people had grown themselves. Seeds displayed like treasures, stories told of successes and failures, and what had been learned. Sophia stood to speak. The old woman had made it through the winter, toughened by grief and purpose. "I want to tell you about my grandmother," she began. "She came to this continent with nothing but the clothes she wore and a small bag of seeds. Those seeds had been in her family for generations. When officials told her she had to give them up, she refused. She served 30 days in detention, and when she was released, she still had the seeds. She'd hidden them in her hair, in the hem of her dress, in places they never thought to search." Sophia pulled out a seed packet. "These are from those original seeds. I've been growing them my entire life, saving seed, keeping the line alive. And now I'm giving them to you, to all of you, because my grandmother didn't preserve these seeds for our family. She preserved them for humanity, because she understood that seeds are memory, that they carry not just genetics, but culture. That food is how we stay connected to our history and to each other." She distributed the seeds an heirloom variety of pepper, small and intensely spicy. "Plant them next spring. Save the seed, share them widely. And remember that we are not the first people to rebuild after a collapse. Humans have survived famines and wars and climate shifts. We've always had agriculture, and we've always had seeds. As long as we have both, we have a future." The winter was still hard, but it was survivable. People had stored harvests, dried beans, cured squash, preserved tomatoes. They supplemented with foraged foods and what little game could be hunted. The nutrition wasn't perfect, but it was sufficient. No one died from starvation. Arya spent the cold months organizing the seed collection. She'd accumulated hundreds of varieties now, from dozens of contributors. Each needed to be labeled, stored properly, and documented. She created a catalog, noting growing requirements, harvest times, special characteristics. It was the beginning of a library, a repository of agricultural diversity. She also began teaching. Children came to her home, kids who had never seen real education since the schools closed. She taught them to read using seed catalogs and growing guides. She taught them math through garden planning. She taught them biology through the life cycles of plants. And most importantly, she taught them that they could feed themselves, that they weren't dependent on systems that had failed them. When spring returned, the planting was organized and efficient. People knew what they were doing now, had learned from their mistakes. The gardens were larger, more diverse. New varieties were introduced from other communities. Seeds were traded, shared, scattered deliberately into wild areas. Arya planted her Brandywine tomatoes again, using seeds she'd saved from the previous year. These were now the second generation grown in Millbrook, beginning the process of adaptation. Over years and decades, if she kept selecting and saving seed, these tomatoes would become their own unique variety, shaped by local conditions and human choices. She also planted new things. A farmer from another community had brought seeds of a grain called quinoa, which he'd kept hidden for 15 years. Someone else had amaranth, a plant that produced nutritious leaves and seeds. The diversity was expanding, creating resilience. The seasons passed. Springs of planting, summers of growth, autumns of harvest, winters of planning. The community became self-sufficient, then started producing surplus. That surplus could be traded with other communities, creating new networks of exchange, not controlled by corporations or governments. 3 years after the ministry's collapse, Arya stood in what had once been her family's assigned plot. It was now a riot of diversity: tomatoes in a dozen colors, beans climbing supports made from scavenged materials, squash sprawling between rows, lettuce providing ground cover, flowers attracting pollinators. It looked nothing like the uniform rows of ministry crops. It looked like a garden. Her sisters were helping with the harvest, the triplets now 12 and capable farmers in their own right. They'd never known the ministry system at its height, had grown up in the rebuilt world. For them, saving seeds and growing diverse crops was normal. The industrial monocultures were history, something from their parents' generation. Arya, one of the triplets Mara, called from the tomato section. "Look at this one." Arya walked over. Mara was holding a brandywine tomato, but it was different from the original variety. Slightly more oblong, with a deeper purple hue. A sport, a genetic variation that had emerged from the population. "Is it bad?" Mara asked. "Should we pull it?" "No," Arya said, examining the fruit. "Save seeds from this plant separately. Label them clearly. This might be the beginning of a new variety, one that's even better adapted to our conditions." She smiled. "This is how it works. This is evolution in action. We plant, we select, we save seed, and the plants become ours, shaped by this place and our choices." Mara carefully harvested the fruit, handling it with the reverence appropriate to potential. That evening, as they processed the harvest, Arya thought about her grandmother. About the moment 3 years ago, when a dying woman had pressed a leather pouch into her hands with whispered instructions. About her grandfather, disappeared for saving seeds. About Finn and Tobias, and all the others who had died during the collapse. They had preserved something essential through the dark times. Not just seeds, but the knowledge of how to use them. The understanding that diversity was resilience, that control was fragile, that real security came from competence and community rather than from dependency on centralized systems. The ministry had tried to make people helpless. To ensure their survival required compliance. But seeds were patient, and humans were stubborn. The illegal became essential. The forbiddens became foundational. What had been suppressed was now celebrated. A new world was growing from the ashes of the old. Not perfect people still argued about the best growing methods, about how to distribute harvests, about planning for the future. But those arguments happened between people who were fed, who had agency, who knew they could feed themselves and their children. Arya opened her notebook and began her nightly documentation. Harvest weights, growing observations, notes about which varieties were performing best. This information would be shared with other communities, contributing to a collective understanding of how to grow food in the changed climate without industrial inputs. She also began writing something new: a history. The story of what had happened, why the ministry system had failed, how the seed savers had preserved alternatives. Future generations needed to understand not just how to grow food, but why diversity mattered. Why the impulse to control and simplify was always tempting and always ultimately destructive. Why the hard work of maintaining variety was worth it. She wrote about her grandmother, about Tobias, about Sean's husband who had betrayed them and then had died when the food shortages hit the cities. She wrote about Finn, who had understood at 12 what it took many adults a lifetime to learn. She wrote about the refugees who had eaten bark and then had learned to farm. She wrote about all of it, the failures and successes, and the long, hard work of rebuilding. The writing took months. When it was finished, she made copies by hand, distributing them to other communities. Some people preserved her account as history. Others used it as a teaching text. It became part of the oral tradition, told and retold, modified and adapted, but always carrying the core message. Diversity is resilience, seeds are freedom, and we are not powerless. 10 years after the collapse, Millbrook hosted a gathering of seed savers from across the region. Hundreds of people came, bringing seeds, knowledge, and stories. They displayed their best vegetables, traded varieties, and shared growing techniques. It was part agricultural fair, part knowledge exchange, part celebration. Arya walked through the displays, marveling at the diversity. There were tomatoes in colors she'd never seen, beans with patterns that looked like art, squash in shapes that seemed impossible. Each variety represented someone's careful work, their patient selection, and seed saving. Each was a small victory against the simplification that had nearly destroyed everything. She stopped at a display from a community 300 miles away. They'd brought a variety of corn they'd bred by crossing 3 different heirloom types. It was adapted to their specific conditions: drought-tolerant, pest-resistant, and nutritious. They were giving away seeds freely, asking only that growers save seed and share with others. "This is what it should be," said a voice beside her. Arya turned to find a young woman, maybe 20, with dirt under her nails and calluses on her hands. Not corporations controlling seeds, not governments mandating uniformity. Just people growing food and sharing what works. "It's what it used to be," Arya replied. "For most of human history, this was normal. We're not inventing something new. We're remembering something old. My parents tell stories about the ministry system, about buying sterile seeds every year, about neighbors reporting each other for saving seeds. It sounds ... She struggled for words. "Insane. Why would anyone design a system like that?" "Control," Arya said. "If people can't feed themselves, they can't rebel. If they're dependent on a centralized system, they have to comply with whatever rules that system imposes. But it failed. All systems based on control eventually fail. They're too rigid to adapt. The question is what comes after." Arya looked around at the gathering hundreds of people who had chosen collaboration over control, diversity over uniformity, community resilience over industrial efficiency. It wasn't perfect. There were still disagreements, still failures, still hunger in bad years. But it was alive in a way the ministry system never had been. It could adapt, evolve, respond to changing conditions. That night, there was music. Someone had brought instruments, and others knew songs from before the collapse. They played and sang around fires, sharing food they'd grown, telling stories about close calls and lucky breaks and what they'd learned. The younger generation listened with the mixture of respect and impatience youth always shows toward elders. Arya found herself sitting with the other original seed savers, the handful who had survived the collapse and the rebuilding. They were older now, marked by hard years, but also softened by success. They'd lived to see their rebellion become normal, their crimes become virtues. "Do you think they understand?" Sophia asked, gesturing toward the younger people. "What it cost? What we risked? They don't need to," Arya replied. "That's the point. For them, this is just how things are. They'll face their own challenges, build on what we've started. That's how it's supposed to work." "I still dream about the burning sometimes," Sophia admitted. "About watching them destroy everything we'd worked for. But they didn't destroy everything. They couldn't, because we'd already scattered the seeds." A young boy approached their fire, maybe 10 years old. He held out a seed packet shyly. "My mom said you're the one who saved the seeds, who hid them from the ministry. Is that true?" Arya took the packet, examining it. Brandywine tomatoes, the label said in handwriting she didn't recognize. But inside were seeds descended from the original pouch her grandmother had given her. They'd been planted, saved, shared, and had traveled across the region. Now they were coming back to her. "I didn't save them alone," she told the boy. "My grandmother saved them. My grandfather died protecting them. A man named Tobias taught me how to grow them. A woman named Chun gave me more varieties when she had to stop. Hundreds of people planted them and saved seed and shared them even when it was dangerous." She held up the packet. "These seeds are alive Because lots of people made lots of small, brave choices. That's how change happens. Not through one hero, but through many people doing what they can with what they have. The boy nodded seriously and ran off to rejoin his friends. Arya watched him go, thinking about all the children who would grow up in a world where saving seeds was normal, where food had flavor and variety, where communities could feed themselves. This was her grandmother's legacy. Not just the seeds themselves, but the understanding that they represented. That life couldn't be controlled completely. That diversity would always find ways to persist. That humans and plants had been partners for millennia, shaping each other through mutual selection and care. The fire burned low. One by one, people drifted to their shelters or their vehicles for the journey home. Arya remained, staring into the embers, thinking about the hollow oak where she'd first hidden the seeds, thinking about her brother Finn, buried beneath a bean plant, thinking about Tobias scattering wheat into the forest, thinking about all the small acts of preservation that had led to this moment. Tomorrow, she would return to her garden. There was always work to do, seeds to save, plants to tend, knowledge to document. But tonight, she simply sat and felt grateful. They'd survived. They'd rebuilt. They'd remembered. And most importantly, they'd kept the seeds alive. Not just physically preserved, but growing, adapting, spreading. The seeds her grandmother had protected were now being grown by thousands of people across hundreds of communities. They'd become what they'd always been meant to be: shared heritage, collective property, the foundation of food security that couldn't be controlled by any single entity. The girl who had hidden seeds in a hollow oak tree was now a woman who had helped rebuild agriculture from its roots. It hadn't been easy. It hadn't been quick. But it had been possible because seeds were patient. They could wait decades for the right conditions. And when those conditions arrived, they grew. Arya finally stood and walked toward her shelter. Behind her, the fire died to embers. Above, stars wheeled across a sky undimmed by city lights. Most urban areas had never recovered their pre-collapse populations. The world was darker, quieter, smaller in some ways. But it was also more connected, more resilient, more alive. She thought about tomorrow's dawn, about returning to her garden, about all the seasons still ahead, about the seeds she would plant and the seeds she would save, about the knowledge she would share and the students she would teach, about the slow, patient work of growing not just food, but a future where hunger wasn't a tool of control. The leather pouch her grandmother had given her was nearly empty now. Its contents had been scattered across the region, planted in hundreds of gardens, saved and shared and passed along. But Arya kept the pouch itself, a reminder of where the journey had started. Sometimes she would hold it and think about the chain of preservation people across generations, making the choice to save something valuable, to protect possibility, to ensure that diversity survived even in the darkest times. That chain was unbroken. And as long as people kept planting, kept saving seed, kept sharing what they grew, it would remain unbroken. Seeds were memory. Seeds were hope. Seeds were the proof that life would persist, that humans and plants would continue their ancient partnership, that even systems designed for control would eventually fail while the patient, persistent power of growth endured. The girl had saved the seeds, and the seeds, in turn, had saved everyone. Might not accept, they'll accept you if you're competent. Prove you know the work, that you care about preservation, that you'll share knowledge freely. That's what matters, not who you are. River was quiet for a long moment. What if I make mistakes? You will make mistakes. Everyone does. The question isn't whether you'll err, but whether you'll learn from it. Whether you'll admit when you're wrong and adjust. That's the only expertise that matters, the willingness to observe outcomes and modify approaches. Over the next 2 years, Arya gradually transferred responsibilities. River began teaching the classes, managing the collection, representing the library at regional council meetings. Arya stayed available for consultation, but stepped back from daily operations. It was harder than she'd expected. She defined herself through this work for so long that stepping away felt like losing part of her identity. But it was necessary. Individuals died. Institutions, if built properly, could persist. She spent more time in her personal garden, experimenting with varieties she'd never had time for. Unusual flowers that attracted specific pollinators. Perennial vegetables that could provide food without annual planting. Wild relatives of domesticated crops that might contribute useful traits through breeding. It was the work she'd always wanted to do, small-scale, detailed, observant. Not managing a library or teaching crowds, but simply working with plants, learning their rhythms, participating in the ancient partnership between humans and domesticated species. One morning, while she was examining a particularly interesting tomato mutation, fruits growing in clusters rather than individually, a stranger appeared at her garden gate. He was middle-aged, travel-worn, with the look of someone who'd come a long distance. "Are you Arya?" he asked. "I am. I've traveled 3 months to meet you. I'm from the western coast. We've been reading your histories, using them to guide our own rebuilding. I wanted to thank you in person." Arya set down the tomato she'd been examining. "You came 3 months just to say thank you? And to ask questions? And to share what we've learned? And to bring seeds varieties from our region that might be useful here?" They talked for hours. He described the coastal communities, how they'd rebuilt with an emphasis on marine resources, combined with terrestrial agriculture. They'd developed varieties adapted to salt spray and sandy soils. They'd learned to use seaweed as fertilizer, to integrate aquaculture with plant growing. Different challenges, different solutions, but the same fundamental principles: diversity, distribution, community resilience. Before he left, the stranger gave Arya a small package. Inside were seeds of a coastal lettuce variety that could tolerate salt exposure. "We developed this over 20 years, he explained, starting with an heirloom that showed some salt tolerance, selecting every generation for plants that could handle increasing salinity. Now it thrives in conditions that would kill normal lettuce." "This is beautiful work," Arya said, examining the seeds. "May I give these to our seed library? They should be widely available. That's why I brought them. No one owns varieties anymore. They belong to everyone." After he left, Arya sat with the seeds for a long time. This stranger had traveled 3 months because her hastily written history had meant something to him, had guided choices made by people she'd never met in places she'd never seen. The work she'd done, the seeds she'd saved, the knowledge she'd shared, the examples she'd tried to set, had rippled outward in ways she couldn't have anticipated. She thought about her grandmother, pressing a leather pouch into her hands with whispered instructions. Had the old woman imagined this? That her carefully preserved seeds would spread across a continent, that her granddaughter would become a symbol of rebuilding, that the work she'd begun would touch thousands of lives? Probably not. Probably she'd just been trying to preserve something valuable, to maintain options for an uncertain future. The grand impact had emerged from small, local actions, multiplied across time and space. Arya was 65 when she decided to write again. Not a history this time, but a guide. Something practical that communities could use to establish their own seed libraries, their own breeding programs, their own networks of preservation. The mistakes to avoid, the principles that mattered, the details that seemed minor but proved crucial. She worked on it for 3 years, filling notebooks with careful instructions and diagrams. River helped, contributing sections on cataloging systems and teaching methods. Others added their expertise: soil building techniques, pest management strategies, storage methods for different seed types. The result was comprehensive hundreds of pages documenting everything they'd learned about community-based seed keeping. They made copies, though in a world without industrial printing, This meant laborious hand copying or primitive reproduction methods. Still, the guides spread. Communities used them to establish their own systems, then modified them based on local conditions, and shared their modifications with others. The information kept flowing, kept evolving, kept adapting. No central authority dictated how things should be done. Just many people experimenting, sharing, learning from successes and failures. It was inefficient by industrial standards, but it was resilient. No single breakdown could stop the whole system. Aria was 70 when she returned to the hollow oak tree where she'd first hidden her grandmother seeds. The tree had died, as trees eventually did, but its hollow trunk remained. She knelt beside it, ran her fingers over the rotting wood. This was where it had started, where she'd made the choice to distribute risk rather than protect everything in one place, where she'd trusted that scattering seeds widely was safer than keeping them secured. She thought about all the places those original seeds had traveled. They'd crossed the continent now, planted in every climate zone, adapted to local conditions, mixed and recombined with other varieties. The genetic diversity that had been compressed into her grandmother's small pouch had exploded outward, creating thousands of local populations. Some of the original varieties had probably gone extinct lost through accident or neglect. But their genes persisted in crosses and hybrids, in the adapted populations that had formed. Nothing was truly lost, just transformed and distributed. She planted something new in the hollow oak remained seeds of a variety called utopian tomato that she'd never seen before. A trader had given them to her, explaining they'd been bred by a community experimenting with perennial tomatoes, trying to create plants that didn't need annual replanting. The experiment probably wouldn't work. Domesticated tomatoes had been annuals for so long that perenniality was likely too complex to breed for easily. But someone was trying. Someone was asking questions, testing possibilities, expanding the boundaries of what could be grown. That spirit of experimentation was what mattered. Not the specific success or failure, but the willingness to try, to question, to imagine different possibilities. That was what would keep food systems adaptable, would prevent the ossification that had made the ministry system so vulnerable. Aria walked home slowly, her joints reminding her of her age. The village had changed so much since her youth. More houses, more people, more diversity of every kind. Children who spoke multiple languages, reflecting the refugee communities that had integrated. Gardens with plant species from across the continent. Technologies adapted from different regions, combined and modified for local use. It was messy, chaotic, alive. Not the sterile order of the ministry system, but the vibrant complexity of functioning ecosystems. And like ecosystems, it would continue adapting, responding to pressures, evolving in unpredictable directions. River met her at the library. "There's someone who wants to meet you," she said. "A researcher from Marcus's collective." Aria sighed. "I thought we'd settled that debate. This is different. They've been experiencing problems. Their engineered varieties are showing unexpected vulnerabilities. They want to access our heirloom collection, to breed in more diverse genetics. They want to take from our commons after years of arguing it was unnecessary. They want to collaborate, to integrate traditional breeding with their techniques. They've learned, basically, that their approach needs what we've been preserving." It was vindicating in a way. The engineered varieties had proven insufficient alone. But vindication wasn't useful. Problem-solving was. "Bring them tomorrow," Aria said. "Let's see what they're actually proposing." The researcher who arrived the next day was young, earnest, and humble. "We made mistakes," he admitted immediately. "We prioritized yield and pest resistance without maintaining sufficient genetic diversity. Now we're vulnerable. A single novel pathogen could wipe out our main food crops. So you need the diversity you argued was inefficient. Yes, we were wrong. Industrial-scale engineering creates the same problems industrial agriculture did, genetic uniformity that's fragile. We need the resilience that comes from diversity, and that diversity exists in your heirloom collections. Our commons, you mean? These seeds don't belong to me or to Millbrook. They belong to everyone, which is why I'm asking. For access, for collaboration. We can offer things to genetic analysis that could help identify useful traits, breeding techniques that could accelerate development of climate-adapted varieties. Not replacing traditional methods, but complementing them. Arya looked at River, who nodded slightly. This was her decision now. Access is free, River said, as always. Take whatever seeds you need. Study them, breed with them, share what you develop. But the results must be open, no patents, no restricted access. Anything developed using our genetic material becomes part of the commons. Agreed. We've learned that lesson too. They worked out details, which varieties might be most useful, what traits the engineered populations needed, how to maintain genetic integrity while allowing for recombination. It was technical but also philosophical, a negotiation about how different approaches could coexist. After the researcher left with seeds and information, River turned to Arya. Do you think this is wise? Giving them access to everything we've preserved? The seeds were never meant to be hoarded. They were meant to be used, adapted, shared. If Marcus's people have learned from their mistakes, if they're willing to work within commons-based principles, then yes, sharing is wise. We learn from each other. And if they repeat their mistakes, then we still have the heirloom backups. That's what resilience means, having options when approaches fail. They can experiment with engineering. We can continue traditional breeding. Others can try different methods entirely. Multiple strategies running in parallel, each learning from the other's successes and failures. It was the philosophy that had guided everything: distribute risk, maintain diversity, keep multiple approaches viable. Never depend on a single method, a single source, a single authority. That was what had allowed them to survive the ministry's collapse. That was what would allow them to survive future challenges. Arya was 75 when she stopped teaching entirely. Her hands shook too much for the delicate work of seed cleaning. Her memory had become unreliable for the detailed cataloging the library required. River had fully taken over, was doing excellent work, had trained apprentices of her own. It was time to let go. She spent her days in her garden, moving slowly but still capable. The work was meditative now, rather than productive. She grew things for beauty as much as utility, experimented with wild species just to understand them, saved seeds more from habit than necessity. The grandchildren of her sisters visited regularly, bringing news from the wider world. The communities were coordinating more effectively now, had developed systems for handling disputes and sharing resources during emergencies. They'd survived droughts and pest outbreaks, had learned from each crisis, had adapted their methods. Marcus's research collective was integrating with traditional farming communities. Their engineered varieties now maintained with heirloom diversity, their methods informed by generations of practical experience. The synthesis was working better than either approach alone had. One afternoon, River brought a visitor, the trader from the coast, who'd given Arya the salt-tolerant lettuce seeds decades earlier. He was old now, gray-bearded and bent, but his eyes were still sharp. "I wanted to see you once more," he said, "to tell you how those seeds traveled, how many communities they've reached, how many people they've fed." "Tell me," Arya said. He described a network spanning the continent. Seeds flowing between regions, adapted to local conditions but maintaining enough similarity to allow for continued exchange. Varieties had proliferated thousands now, maybe tens of thousands, each one a unique combination of genetics and local adaptation. "We've restored diversity beyond what existed before the collapse," he said, "because we're not just preserving the old varieties. We're creating new ones constantly, through breeding and selection and adaptation. The gene pool is expanding. That's how it should be. Seeds were never meant to be museum pieces, frozen in time. They're meant to evolve, to adapt, to respond to changing conditions. Your grandmother would be amazed, I think, to see what grew from her preservation. Or maybe she wouldn't be surprised at all. Maybe she understood that seeds were patient, that they'd wait however long was necessary, that they'd grow when conditions were right. They sat in comfortable silence, two old people who'd spent their lives working with seeds, watching the afternoon sun angle across a garden that represented decades of accumulated knowledge. "I'm dying," the trader said eventually. "Cancer, probably from environmental exposure during the collapse. I wanted to make this journey before I became too weak. I'm glad you came. Will you do something for me? There's a variety I developed, a papal tree that can grow in coastal conditions, tolerating salt spray and sandy soil. I have grafting wood with me. Will you plant one so something of my work continues here?" Of course. They grafted the apple together the next day, Arya shaking hands guided by the trader's steady ones. The work was difficult, requiring precision she no longer quite possessed, but they managed. The scion was attached to rootstock, wrapped carefully, given time to heal and integrate. The trader left the following morning, heading home to die in familiar surroundings. Arya never saw him again, but she tended his apple tree carefully. It grew slowly, adapting to conditions very different from the coast where it had been developed. 3 years later, it produced its first fruit small, tart apples marked by its genetic heritage and shaped by its new environment. She saved seeds from those apples, knowing they wouldn't grow true apple seeds were highly variable, each one potentially producing a completely different tree. But that was fine. The variability was potential, was options for future selection, was the raw material of adaptation. Arya was 80 when she began to understand she was dying. Nothing dramatic, just a slow diminishment. Food tasted less interesting. Sleep came less easily. The garden, which had always been a source of joy, became more of a duty. She stopped tending most of it, maintaining only a small section near her house. River and others helped with the rest, keeping the plants alive, saving seeds, continuing the work. They brought her harvests, showed her unusual mutations, asked for her opinion on selection decisions. She gave advice when she could, but increasingly she told them to trust their own judgment. She'd taught them principles, but principles needed to be applied flexibly, adapted to specific situations. They knew the garden better than she did now. They should trust what they saw. Her last planting was a Brandywine tomato. She'd saved seeds from the original variety for over 50 years now, selecting always for the best combination of flavor and productivity. The variety had adapted to Millbrook's conditions, becoming something slightly different from what her grandmother had given her. She planted a single seed, watered it, watched it germinate. The familiar curve of the stem pushing through soil, the cotyledons opening, the first true leaves developing. The cycle she'd watched thousands of times, never losing its sense of miracle. The plant grew as she declined. It set fruit as she took to her bed, too weak now to spend much time upright. River brought her a fruit from the plant enormous, perfect, the deep red-purple of the original variety. "Taste it," Arya said. River sliced the tomato. The smell filled the room, sweet and acidic and intensely alive. She handed Arya a piece. The flavor was extraordinary, complex and balanced and rich. Everything a tomato should be. Everything the ministry varieties had never been. Everything her grandmother had died to preserve. "Save the seeds," Arya whispered. "Keep the variety going. Teach others. Remember why it matters. I will. And tell the story. About where these came from. About everyone who worked to keep them alive. About what was lost and what was restored. I promise." Arya closed her eyes. She could taste the tomato still, could smell the garden through her open window, could hear children playing somewhere nearby, children who would grow up knowing how to feed themselves, who would inherit a world with options. The work wasn't finished. It would never be finished. Each generation would face new challenges, would need to adapt the agricultural systems they'd inherited, would make new choices about what to preserve and what to change. But the foundation was solid now. The knowledge had been distributed. The seeds were scattered widely enough that no single catastrophe could eliminate them. She'd done her part, had continued what her grandmother started, had passed it to River and countless others, had ensured the chain of preservation remained unbroken. Now she could rest. Arya died on a late summer evening, with her garden visible through the window and the scent of ripe tomatoes in the air. They buried her beside her family, beneath a tree grown from seeds she'd saved decades earlier. River planted a brandywine tomato at her grave, and every year after, volunteers maintained it, saving seeds, continuing the variety. The leather pouch her grandmother had given her went to River, empty but still soft with handling. River kept it in the seed library as a reminder of where they'd come from, of what had been preserved through dark times, of the patient work of maintaining diversity and distributing power. The story spread in the years after Arya's death. It was told to children learning to garden, to communities establishing new seed libraries, to anyone who needed reminding why the work mattered. The details changed with each telling. Some versions emphasized Arya's bravery, others her grandmother's foresight, others the collaborative work of many seed savers. But the core remained constant. Seeds were survival, diversity was resilience, and freedom meant the ability to feed yourself. River continued Arya's work for another 40 years, training new seed keepers, expanding the library's collection, adapting methods to changing conditions. The climate continued to shift, requiring constant breeding for new adaptations. But the foundation Arya had helped establish distributed preservation, community-based breeding. Commons-based sharing proved flexible enough to handle the challenges. The brandywine tomato variety spread across the continent, adapting to different conditions, becoming dozens of local variations while maintaining its essential characteristics. In some places, it crossed with other varieties, creating new hybrids. In others, it was maintained in its traditional form. Both approaches were valid, both were necessary. 100 years after the collapse, the world had stabilized into a new pattern. Not a return to industrial civilization. That foundation had proven too fragile. Instead, a network of communities coordinating loosely, sharing knowledge and resources, but maintaining enough independence to allow for experimentation and diversity. Food was grown locally by people who understood the work. Seeds were saved and shared freely. Agricultural methods varied by region, reflecting different climates and cultures. There was no single authority dictating practices, no centralized system to depend on or be vulnerable to. It wasn't perfect. Hunger still existed. Harvests still failed. People still made mistakes, still had to learn hard lessons. But the system was resilient, able to absorb shocks, to adapt to changing conditions, to recover from failures, because redundancy was built into its fundamental structure. The girl who'd saved the seeds became legend, her story simplified and mythologized by time. But in seed libraries across the continent, in gardens where heirloom varieties grew, in the practices of communities that prioritized diversity and distribution, her real legacy persisted, not as monument, but as living practice. Not as history, but as ongoing work. And in fields and gardens everywhere, brandywine tomatoes grew heavy with fruit, rich with flavor, carrying in their genetics the accumulated choices of generations. They were food, and they were history, and they were future all at once. They were proof that small acts of preservation, multiplied across time and space, could restore what had been lost and create something resilient enough to endure. The seeds were patient. The seeds survived. And as long as people kept planting, kept saving, kept sharing, they would continue to grow.